I'm Andrea, a passionate DEI advocate and consultant on a mission. Join me in each episode as we celebrate diversity, ignite conversations, and craft workplaces and educational institutions where everyone thrives. This podcast is my commitment to making a meaningful impact on the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So are you ready? Let's get diversifused. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Get Diversifused podcast. I'm your host, Andrea Horton-Mericli, founder of Diversifuse Consulting and a passionate DEI advocate and ally. In today's episode, which is our last episode for season 1, we will discuss DEI without borders, global perspectives, privilege, and courageous conversations with our guest speaker, Gisele Marcus. As a first-generation college graduate possessing an MBA from Harvard Business School and a Bachelor of Science in Business from Syracuse University, Giselle has soared above perceived limits. As a 5-time general manager managing businesses up to $800 million, she has worked at brands such as Accenture, AT&T, Johnson Controls, and Thermo Fisher Scientific. Her career has been entrenched in turning around departments, divisions, and entire organizations where improving financial performance, enhancing operational efficiency, and reversing failed relationships were the goalposts. Giselle is the Vice Dean of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Olin Business School at Washington University in St. Louis. At this institution, she also serves as the Professor of Practice, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, DEI, where she prepares students with the tools and techniques for DEI in the workplace by teaching this required course for MBA students. In addition, she is a corporate director for First Mid Bank Shares Incorporated, the parent company of First Mid Bank and Trust National Association. I actually had to look up what NA meant because I did not know. It stands for National Association if you did not know.
You could even leave NA off. It's not that important.
Oh, okay.
You can leave it off.
Okay.
Because they probably forgot that it's NA too.
That's good to know. Giselle has been named a 2-time international best-selling author for penning chapters titled Networking, How to Set Yourself Apart and Clarity Out of Chaos, and From Harlem to Harvard in Overcoming Living Our Best Life in Spite of. She has launched a TEDx titled Networking Made Easy and has been featured in the Huffington Post, Black Enterprise, Entrepreneur Magazine, and the Milwaukee and St. Louis Business Journals. Most recently, Giselle was quoted in the BBC article entitled, DEI is a lightning rod for controversy, but the practice isn't dead. She has been a repeat guest on Good Morning St. Louis on the Fox affiliate in St. Louis, Missouri. She resides in St. Louis, Missouri, and is a newlywed, congratulations, who is thrilled to have expanded her family to 4 bonus sons. Wow, that's a lot of sons. 3 daughters in love and 5 bonus grandchildren. In giving back to the community, she has a passion for addressing the needs of parentless children. Her favorite country to explore is Africa, where she has visited 14 countries. So welcome, Giselle, to the Get Diversifused podcast. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you for having me. Your attitude is infectious and I love it.
Awesome.
Thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. Thanks for being my guest. So I was very excited when you agreed. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, like your career at the university and your authorship and your speaking engagements. How did you get involved in all that from pretty much like your thing from Harlem to Harvard?
Yes. So where did it all start? So I'll say it started in corporate America because I've only been in higher education for 3 years. So this is actually new industry for me. And I like to say that I have been in corporate America since Jesus was a baby, because it does feel that way. And in my career, I started off after graduating from Harvard in marketing because I thought that's what I wanted to do. So I ended up in new product development at what is now AT&T, and I launched a couple new products, and that was great. But I'm the type of person, I like to know how I'm doing along the way at work, as opposed to waiting till the end of the year to find out how I'm doing. So I'm
getting shocked.
Exactly. So I questioned being in new product development. And so what would have happened to my performance review if I wouldn't have launched a new product. Does that
Mm-hmm.
mean that my performance would have been denoted as not being good?
Mm-hmm.
My fault that I didn't launch it. Is it the market? Because the division I was in hadn't launched a new product in a while. So that was something that often just gnawed at me, although I thought marketing was really where I wanted to be. And I ended up working in the call center. And that is when I learned that I wanted to pivot from marketing to operations. And that was because when you're in a call center, you know how you're doing every single day.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, you know your call to answer rate, you know the number of calls you've addressed, you know the average time it's taken for you to address a call. So knowing all of that helped me. And I was in compliance actually in the
Mm-hmm.
call center. So the metrics were really important and I liked that. So from
Oh, wow.
there, I really wanted to run businesses. So I wanted to have P&L, profit and loss, so the ability to run a business in my work. And I've always been in service industries. And you
Okay.
mentioned some of the places where I've worked. And my P&L started when I was at Johnson Controls, where I was in facility management, corporate real estate, and a client will actually have a portfolio and have us manage it. And then you'd have P&L. So I started off managing the Ericsson account in Dallas. That was like a $30
Oh,
million
wow.
account. And that's quite sizable
Yeah.
for me to manage. And then from there, just really kind of kept increasing the amount of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And the golden ring that I wanted was to be able to be a global profit and loss leader.
Wow.
But to do that, Andrea, the company said, well, we have to know that you can actually work abroad outside of your own country. I was like, that probably makes sense.
Yeah, what an experience that probably was.
Yes, yes. So I ended up working in Johannesburg in South Africa for a full year post-apartheid. So this was like 2009 to 2010.
Okay.
And after that was when I was able to get what I had been desiring in my corporate career. Really, I wanted to run like $1 billion business, almost $800 million. So at Johnson Controls, that was our financial services group. And we had clients in like over 40 countries across 5 continents. So that I would say was one of my favorite roles. But throughout all of my work and general management, I always found my way back to diversity somehow, some way. And it wasn't always it wasn't necessarily the titled role. So I'm not someone who came up through diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
And I would suffice to say, when I was doing the work, there weren't even titles when I started doing the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I would always find my way to like an employee resource group, for example. And I remember at Johnson Controls in particular, I helped for the Black employee resource group, I worked with our sponsor in terms of setting a DEI strategy,
Mm-hmm.
as well as how do we actually implement that and evangelize it in the workplace. But that was outside of my standard work.
Mm-hmm.
And in addition to that, being a general manager, you also have a pulse on, you have to make purchases. So in terms of
Mm-hmm.
procurement, I would always have an eye toward, well, are we looking at diverse suppliers in the work that we do? And one of the roles that I had that I so enjoyed, it was called, this was when I was still at Johnson Controls. It was called General Manager of the Metro Markets Strategy for Chicago. And what this was, it was $1 billion strategy where we as a company were looking at how could we support minority-owned, women-owned, veteran-owned, et cetera, types of businesses. We were already in the $1 billion roundtable, meaning
Wow.
we were spending $1 billion with diverse suppliers already.
Mm-hmm.
But to bring that up a notch, how can we actually support companies like that where they're able to grow their business,
Nice.
but not as a it's a great thing to do. Not just that, but symbiotically, how can they help us? How can we help them? So one of the examples, Andrea, that I often tell is I had the benefit to work with a young lady. Her name is Margaret Garner. She was the first African American woman to build a Walmart store. So she had a construction company and she built it in Chicago. And she was also very key to them being able to build it in Chicago because they were getting a lot of pushback in terms of, what that brand can do to small businesses, right? And she was still in government. So she had contacts. So she was able to help them get that built. So what it did for us is, for some reason, our salespeople struggled to get our mechanical equipment in Walmart. So with her, I know, isn't that, it sounds.
I thought Walmart sold everything.
Exactly. No, I would say, for us to be able to put so Johnson Controls, we do facility management and we also have mechanical equipment. So HVAC equipment for businesses. So we weren't, our salespeople had not been successful trying to get our mechanical equipment sold to Walmart. Gotcha. And for building the stores, there's the possibility that she could pull our product through. So that was a benefit for us. But what was in it for her? So what was in it for her? She could only, as a small business, she could only bond to build one store at a time. And she wanted the opportunity to be able to build more than one store at a time, which made sense to us. And as a corporation, that's an opportunity for a risk. And then generally, we usually have excess bonding capacity anyway. So that was a symbiotic relationship, but that shows how this whole movement of diversity and equity and inclusion, in your supplier base, how that can increase the revenue for your own business. So that was when I had a role that was somewhat titled in the DEI space. And then from there, I took a turn into a nonprofit. I worked at the St. Louis Regional Chamber. And people were like, that sounds, why? Doesn't sound like it goes with everything else. And I was like, it does, because when you run an $800 million business, what you don't have, Andrea, as you know, is you don't have all of the employees that impact your business reporting to you. So you'll have some that directly report, then you'll have some that are matrix. And I was like, I really want the whole enchilada. How can I get that? And I spent so much time interviewing at a point for like chief operating officer roles, didn't work out. And then suddenly one day, a executive recruiter from Hydrick and Struggles called me and said, I have the perfect job for you. And she said, hear me out before you tell me no. It was this role at the St. Louis Regional Chamber. And the reason it was attractive is because I would be able to be a chief operating officer. It was at the time one of the top 10 revenue generating chambers in the country.
Wow.
So that was exciting. And they had 14 back office departments that I have responsibility for. So like marketing, investor relations, IT, etc. And I was like, and then the opportunity to work alongside the CEO as it related to partnering with him on the strategy. So that was nirvana for me. So I made that move, but at a time after we had the incident with in Ferguson, the incident that happened, not George Floyd, but Ferguson. For that.
What's his
So I'm like, now you're gonna have to edit this.
Yeah. Exactly. Both of us are like, what is it?
So that's okay. I'm gonna say. So I joined the St. Louis Regional Chamber after the tragic incident that happened in Ferguson. So there was like high alert just around the importance of diversity in the community of St. Louis. So I say all this to say that even though it hasn't necessarily been titled in my job, I've always found my way in the space, so to speak. And I was looking for an opportunity post-COVID and applied for an operations job here at Washington University that I had a 8-minute interview. I think it was the fastest interview ever. I should go in the Guinness Book of Records, maybe, because I was overqualified for it.
Oh, wow.
And long story short, in terms of networking and looking at that role, there was someone that I knew through the Harvard Business School alumni club that worked here, and made my way to someone that worked here at Olin, who coincidentally was the chair of the organizational behavior department where my role in teaching sits. So she says to me, so I went back and said, hey, that role didn't work out because she'd given insights about that, but just wanted to close the loop. And she said, have you ever thought about teaching? So I said, never. Andrea, I said, never. I said, well, you have a TEDx. You do public speaking. She said, public speaking is like teaching. And I said, I can't deny that.
Yeah.
So from there is how I got swept up into the opportunity to be a professor of practice here at Olin Business School. And and as you know, but I'll just share for the audience, in being a professor of practice, I teach from a perspective of what's practical in the workplace as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, versus a professor that is tenured, right? That would teach more so from perspective of research. So we're a research institution, so I must back up what I teach with research, but my focus is in the workplace day to day. My MBA students, how might you show up in the workplace as a leader to lead across differences? So I teach a class called Leading Across Differences. And it's all about how our students can be best prepared to work with individuals that have diversity dimensions that may differ from theirs. So that's how I came into this role. And then in last year, I was asked, would I entertain being the vice dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion as well? We had a new dean coming in, and it was really a challenging question to answer because, as you know, this space can be very challenging. And if it's something challenging and political. Yes, Andrea, very much so. So I had at least 100 questions, maybe not that many, but maybe like 10, in regard to our commitment, right? And the fact that I love working here. I said, so I don't want to have my excitement of working here disturbed, if we don't walk the talk, right? So, but long story short, turns out I thought I got comfortable with where we were going with our new leader. So I took the role on interimly at first because it gave him an opportunity. Because I said, because he's new, I said, maybe he might want someone else in the role. Yeah. So to give him space, and then also to give myself space that, if it wasn't exactly ringing the bell for me, that I could step away without feeling awkward about it. Because oftentimes when we take on new roles, you're in it.
Yep. It's that or nothing.
So long story short, that's actually how I got here. But I will tell you, Andrea, I feel that I am the right leader at the right time to do this type of work. And the fact that I'm really wearing two hats, right? So I'm wearing the professor hat in teaching, but I'm also wearing the staff hat in leading the strategy for DEI, for Olin Business School, and partnering with my dean to make sure that we execute that.
Awesome. Wow. That's a lot of work, and that's important work. So, especially in today's times.
Yes.
So yeah, and definitely come next year, moving forward. So,
yes.
Yeah. So that is wow. So you've actually moved around quite a bit. I was like, you were in Chicago, and you were in Johannesburg, and you're in. I'm like, wow.
Yes, Andrea, I would say, I think since undergrad, this is probably my 6th or 7th city where I've lived. And I will say that my moving has really been for the purpose of opportunities to advance my career. And because at that time I didn't have personally any young people or a husband, I didn't necessarily have to worry about someone else's career or
Yeah.
pulling someone out of school.
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, it gave me the opportunity to move around for, but I would say some pretty great opportunities.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Wow. Um, I always tell new graduates, whether they're well, more so the college graduates than the recent high school ones, like, if you can live in another country, do it. The recent college graduates, teach English overseas. You get, it's a wonderful cultural experience. And you can travel. You get paid well. You can start paying your loans off if you have loans. And it's such a great learning experience. You just get exposed to people from all over the world when you live overseas. And as even though we're called expats, we're immigrants in other countries. I still understand the expat thing,
Yes,
but yeah, it's just amazing to all the cultures and ways of life that you can experience. It's very eye opening and to whatever country you're from, the goods and the bads of your own country, like
yes,
where you guys are doing well and where you guys need work, because every country has that. But yeah, so
it does. But I agree with you. And that's great advice for a young person. I wish someone would have told me that because I didn't take on this expat assignment in Johannesburg, South Africa. I didn't work abroad
Mhm.
until I was 39.
Oh,
And I wish that when I was in undergrad, that someone would have told me to take
mhm.
hold to study abroad. And I'm first generation, so there really
Mhm.
wasn't someone to tell me that. But I think that
Exactly.
it's great advice because our world is becoming more global.
Mm-hmm.
Companies are becoming more global.
Yep.
So, as a citizen of no matter where you live, the
Mm-hmm.
ability to work across cultures well is important and key. And I believe that our students that learn that are going to be very successful in their careers, no matter what discipline they may choose.
I agree. I agree. And yeah, so as I was saying, every college student I meet, I'm like, you gotta do it, because they never think about it, and especially the first gens like you and we don't think about it. Like, I didn't go overseas until I was in my early 30s, and it's yeah, you can just do so much more when you're not that you can't when you're older, but when you're younger, and as you said, when you're not there's nothing tying you to a place. So
Correct.
yeah. So yeah. So talking about the globe and the global workplace and all, um, how do DEI initiatives differ around the globe that you've experienced and seen, and what cultural considerations should organizations keep in mind when implementing DEI strategies in different countries?
Sure, great question. So I would say that the influences of DEI differ around the globe, a number of factors. And this is probably not an exhaustive list, but it can be influenced by the local history, by societal norms, by labor laws,
Mm-hmm.
by even the cultural attitudes, toward diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I would say that's pretty much where it stems from in terms of why and how it could be different. And just to give an example, if you think about the United States, let's say Western Europe, for example, um, diversity, equity, and inclusion is heavily shaped by racial issues, pretty much, right? That stem from history, histories of slavery, of segregation, of the civil rights movement. And if you think about Western Europe, often the focus is more on like national origin, language, religion, due to
Mm-hmm.
histories of like colonialism and even current immigration patterns, for example. Um, so that's an example of why DEI initiatives can be different
Mm-hmm.
um, in other in different countries. Why it's not the same. That's why I always tell my students when I teach them in the classroom, I'm teaching them about diversity, equity, and inclusion here in the United States mostly. And I tell them, you cannot package this, put it in a suitcase, take this to China, and you implement it. It's going to be different. Why? Because of what I just mentioned, right? All of these different contexts. And in different countries, the other thing that that we see is that when you think about, when you think about different countries, there's different privileges in different countries. Different people are privileged in different countries, I guess is what I'll say. And typically you'll see that the DEI landscape in the workplace somewhat addresses that. What I mean by that is you would say here in the United States, the privileged people have been the Caucasians, right? And typically in the workplace, the Caucasian male.
Yeah.
And then that would mean that ethnic minorities and women, right, would be in the minority. So a lot of efforts that you see in the United States, that's why they're usually geared towards women. That's why they're usually geared towards ethnic minorities, because for years, hundreds, that those particular groups have been disadvantaged.
Yeah.
And a good example of this is I think about, there was a time when ethnic minorities could not be in the trades. And I think about this when I worked at Johnson Controls, because you're dealing with mechanical equipment, you're dealing with people that are in the trades. So when you look at who elevated, it was mostly the upper echelon were mostly Caucasian males. It would be real difficult to have someone there that had ethnicity of mine or yours, because 20, not 20, but years prior, we weren't even able to learn that particular trade.
Interesting.
So therefore, you end up being behind. And how do you then catch up?
Yeah.
Have such big of a gap. So that is how and why in different countries, the DEI focuses are different.
I agree. Yeah, because the histories and, as you said, the histories, the cultures, the experiences are all different. There's other countries that are more on the outside, just looking in as an outsider, more homogeneous looking, for a lack of a better term. But there's still differences.
Yes, absolutely.
And those differences are, create biases, create discrimination, create violence in many instances.
Unfortunately, yes. Unfortunately, yes.
And it's interesting that you brought up the trades, because it's starting to slowly improve. Like they're trying to recruit more women and into the trades. But when I was a career counselor, I guess it was like 10 years ago, I was working with immigrants and refugees, and there was this Russian immigrant who had a very common male name in his country, but because it ended in a Y, it sounded female in the United States. And he was in construction management, had great experience, fantastic experience. And after a little bit of restructuring, not much, but just reformatting a little bit of his resume to have different focuses and stuff, I mentioned the thing about name discrimination and how the trades are, construction has predominantly been male. And because he had been here for like 2 years before I saw him, I was like his fifth counselor organization. And nobody told him about that. He went by the abbreviated name without the Y at the end, which sounded male. So we just took that off. I was like, you can put that on your resume, because your application is going to have your legal name. And within a week, he had 5 callbacks. 5. And he got, 3 offers. And it's like, good offers, because it was construction management. So it's sad that even that recent, it's still happening, where there's that implicit bias that affects hiring decisions.
Yes.
And for listeners, even today it's happening. There's that
It is.
implicit bias because people
It
are
is.
people. Yep.
And when you think about, similarly to what you're sharing, there's a lot of research out there about names on resumes, right? And when you have people versus the computer or AI looking at
which
resumes.
is inputted by people.
Yes, which is inputted by people. You're so right. There have been all these studies where they've used ethnic sounding names, same resume,
Yep.
change the name to a non-ethnic sounding name, and suddenly that person gets the interview. So to your point, that bias does exist. And we know, I mean, everyone has biases. And, bias isn't necessarily a bad word. It's just about how you use it. So if you have a bias and you're aware of it, so if you know that you have a bias around names and at my organization, we have blind resume reviews, that may be better for me. And maybe even for our organization. And a number of organizations have gone to that for exactly that reason.
I wish more organizations would. And when it comes to that AI software, I'm still uncomfortable with it. I still like applications to be read and reviewed by human eyes because of that. It's improved since it came out, but there's still the chances of not even getting seen for the reason that you just said. There could be that name discrimination through AI. I know there was companies a few years ago, I think Amazon and what was Uber? I know it was definitely Amazon, where it was automatically declining female applications for the warehouse. And they realized their error quite quickly, and fixed it. But it's those glitches that will happen until somebody notices. And if nobody notices, how many qualified applicants? Now, granted, there's unqualified applicants that apply too, but how many qualified applicants are getting declined automatically? And just not having that opportunity to even get face-to-face with someone and be a competitive candidate among other candidates who may have equal qualifications, lesser qualifications, or higher qualifications. So,
which is why the human interaction is still very important.
Yes, and I tell applicants and candidates all the time about targeting their stuff and their documents, and not because one job could get 100 plus applications, and if they're all being read by human eyes, they need to which is, as we said, is our preference, is they have to make their documents stand out, because that is their first impression.
That's right.
So you already touched a little bit on the power of privilege, but what are some ways in which unchecked privilege can hinder progress in DEI?
Wow. One way is, if privilege is unchecked, what often happens is whatever the dominant cultural norms are, those become the norms of the environment, right? So that means in terms of what your communication styles are like, how the privileged group behaves. So for example, if they, scan out names of people that are ethnic sounding, that, even though you're not saying it, that can actually catch on in an organization to become a norm. That even if you're in a group that's not in the majority, that you may begin to do that too, right? So I think that is one challenge when privilege is unchecked. And the other gets at what you talked about before, which is people will struggle to recognize systemic biases. Because if they are going along to so-called get along,
Oh,
And
yeah.
people are not required or don't think it's important to understand that they have a bias. Well, that actually gets in the way
Mm-hmm.
of the work. And not only does it get in the way of the work, but it can also, inadvertently offend someone. I mean, I always tell my students, we're always just going to assume that people mean the best, that people are well intended.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, sometimes things do happen, with biases in the workplace. And I have there are a few video snippets that I play, and I think it is, I can't remember who created them, but they're really good in terms of, like, for example, there is a young lady um who gets into, she's excited, she's a woman of color, don't know what, from what ethnicity, but she says, hey, I got into Columbia. And then the other lady in the video is a Caucasian female, and she says, really? Oh, that's great. How did you do that? And then the woman who said she got in says, wow, do you not see me? Why would you even ask me something like that? So she somewhat got
Mm-hmm.
offended, right? But in terms of biases, when I have my students kind of cut their teeth on it, some people see something wrong with it, some people do not.
Mm-hmm.
So I always tell my students that even if you think you're not offending someone, you possibly could inadvertently, and
Yeah.
be open that if someone mentions it to you, right? What do? We apologize,
Mm-hmm.
sincerely for it,
Yeah.
but it also creates the opportunity to have dialogue in the workplace. But I feel that when you have privilege that is unchecked, such biases like that, they just continue to fester because no one corrects.
Mm-hmm.
And then last but not least, I'll say privilege unchecked also leads to what I would call a devaluing of diverse perspectives. Um, because when you have a culture that just runs with what the dominant culture is,
Yeah.
anything else that tries to lead, speak up, raise their hand, sometimes can be ignored or not heard, and
Mm-hmm.
definitely feel not valued.
Yeah. And I think pretty much everybody, no matter what race, color, religion, sexual orientation you are, has felt that way at one time or another, if not more.
And I think
And
that that is a good equalizer too,
mm-hmm.
in terms of when we talk about this work in the workplace. I think a good equalizer, Andrea, is just that, in terms of, oh my gosh, I just like lost my thought.
About
Disappeared.
not feeling valued or heard or
Yes.
respect.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna start over. Um,
Okay.
so to your point, a good way, a way to talk about diversity in the workplace and the importance of the equity piece and the importance of including others, um, often comes down to what you were speaking about. It's really about that feeling of being valued, seen, heard, which really is what inclusion and belonging are all about. And
Mm-hmm.
any and everybody can attest to a time when they felt that they were not included. So often in my class, I utilize an exercise to talk about belonging, and a word I created, unbelonging. And I have them pair up and just talk about a situation where they felt they belonged and one where they felt they did not, and what was the difference in there. So to your point,
Mm-hmm.
that's something that equalizes everyone.
Yeah.
And given where we're going in this country with this work,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the ability to find more matters of alignment for us to be able to learn how to work with people that are different is just going to be becoming much more important.
I agree. I agree. Because the analogy I like to use to get everybody to relate to how it feels to be sectioned out or not heard or uncomfortable in a certain situation is your friend invites you to a party that with their friends, it's a big party, and the only person you're going to know is your friend, and they say they're going to meet you there. And then you get there and they don't show up. And you're trying to, you don't know anyone. So unless you're a very big social butterfly, which is very rare, it's uncomfortable because you're like, well, who do I speak? Because usually people go with friends and they're in their cliques and everything, and they're talking and they bring up things that happened before and they're all laughing about it. You don't know them. You don't know those situations I'm talking about because you weren't there. And so it's very uncomfortable. Or another situation is like being a new kid in the class, in the school. So, that's another situation when you were younger. I think unless you stayed in the same home all the time, which can happen. I mean, there's people that, went to the same, schools, lived in the same house all their life. But for those that didn't, that moved at least once or more, you had to start a new school and break in, try to, make new friends. And it's uncomfortable because people stare at you, people will chuckle at you and and whisper behind your back sometimes. So it can, be very uncomfortable. So I like to try to get people to relate who to the purpose of DEI, and that it's not just for marginalized populations. Yes, it does help raise the awareness, but it's for everybody. It benefits everyone. So
it does. It does.
Mm-hmm. So cool. So thank you so much for answering that unchecked privilege, and also for talking about the workplace culture to a certain extent, like how it can affect how people's attitudes and actions when it comes to trying to be included and being part of the gang. So being in HR, I always am wary of saying, we have a great workplace culture, or when hiring managers like, well, I want to make sure that they're part, the team culture here, I want to make sure that they can be part of the team. And like, well, what is the team culture there? Why can't they add to it, to their diverse perspectives and stuff? So I don't like to make the culture part of the hiring decision.
Makes sense. And, and really when you talk about culture, I mean, I believe that, that too, it's all about, do people even feel included, right, in the culture that you create? And really the culture that you have is not what your website says oftentimes, right?
Exactly.
Or if you come into a reception area, sometimes you'll have, these are our values. Mm-hmm. And then you work with your organization, you're like, wow, I don't really see that, right? Mm-hmm. So what I always tell individuals is the culture is how people behave when no one else is watching. It's it's like how do people naturally work in your organization when like executive management isn't around? How do they behave? I mean, that is what your culture is.
That is true. That is true. And my previous podcast guest mentioned something similar. It's like, what are people doing behind the scenes? And are they actually living, the values and stuff like that? So it's and
I would say too, that, and then what I would say too, that your values are also, so let's say you have a value around, what would be a good example? Just that you treat people well in your environment, right?
Respect.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. That's a good one. So let's say respect in the workplace. Mm-hmm. And let's say someone grossly disrespects you. Yeah. Say you're in a meeting and, you said something that someone didn't agree with, and they got up, started yelling, pounding their fist on the desk. Wow. That would be respectful, right? Mm-hmm. But if your organization doesn't address that, that says that disrespect is okay in your organization. So it's also the things that you don't point out that people are doing that you say isn't part of your culture. If you allow it to happen, that is your culture.
And it's even important for listeners. It's even important, like if it's your supervisor or somebody in leadership that is acting that way, there are departments at your workplace that address that, and it can be anonymous. Like employee labor in the relations or the grievance, wherever you have to, wherever it is you file grievances in human resources at your organization, they're there for a reason. Now,
Correct.
And if you report it and nothing gets done, then you have a decision to make.
And then the unfortunate part of that too is sometimes people don't report it because they feel that the culture is one in which what they have to say would not be valued. So sometimes those, in all organizations, there typically is a place where you can do that. But you have to also have a culture where people feel comfortable.
Yes.
And that just kind of gets into a culture that's inclusive, right?
Yeah. That is so true. Yeah. And if you don't feel like your organization has that safe space, then, like we said before, that tells you a lot right there. Because not every organization walks the walk. Sometimes it's just things on paper.
Correct. And then you have to decide, you have to decide as an employee, is that okay with you? Right. Exactly. And it's okay, to make that decision, because I believe since COVID too, really, people really have been looking at culture, I think more so than they had historically. Especially our millennials, right, are demanding.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, right? That's one thing they look at.
Yes.
Definitely look at the culture. Apply.
And I have to say, when I got out of undergrad, that wasn't even anything on my radar.
Yeah. I mean, we were like vision, values. What's that? Informational interviews, huh? That's right. I mean, it wasn't talked about. Yeah. So speaking about grievances and stuff, what are some of the legal ramifications of discrimination in the workplace, and why should companies care about DEI from a risk management perspective?
Great question. So this is a topic that I talk to my students about too, because we have a section that's called like legal protections. So I talk to them about, we do have, and this is helpful too for our international students. There are guardrails in the United States in the workplace, right? So we have, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Right, that deals with, you can't discriminate, based on race, based on color, based on religion, based on national origin, which is why and how Denny's got in trouble, the restaurant chain.
Oh, right? I hadn't heard about this. Wait, what? When did this happen? Not my Grand Slam, but
right.
Oh my god!
So all of those lawsuits, like back in the 1990s, right, for racial discrimination against Black customers, right. And one of those cases, I think this might have just kind of been the tipping point, involved like a Black Secret Service agent, right, who was denied service. Wow. So Denny's actually settled cases. I think it was like up to like $54 million. That's a lot of Grand Slams.
Yeah.
Gotta sell a lot of Grand Slams.
$2.99.
To make $54 million. Right. Yeah. So that's one. Also, there's an age discrimination act, where if you're, over 40, because there's often been mistreatment of people that are older. And an example of this that I tell my students about is at IBM. And this was actually documented, like their leaders were referring to, and this is at a time when, remember, IBM was like carte blanche, like everyone wanted to work. And then what started happening was they started getting competition from like the Accentures of the world, that had younger employees. So they already have an embedded base of employees that are older. They started referring to their employees as dino babies. And it was executive leadership doing this.
Wow.
And they had it
like older themselves.
Right. In emails And documentation. And this was a
in
really
written
big
correspondence.
Lawsuit. In written correspondence.
Wow.
So this is, so, and then we have the Equal Pay Act, right? And that's mostly to help close the gap, between men and women, how they're paid. And then we have laws in regard to people that have disabilities, right? Right, where they're supposed to be treated fairly too. And I remember in my class we talked about a situation with it was Uber, where they give you that like 5 minutes that you have to be able to get into the car, and if not, they take off or they charge you a fee.
Oh yeah, they'll only wait for
a certain number of minutes. Yeah. Well, that was a problem with people that have disabilities. So if you're in a wheelchair, or if you're someone that has a challenge walking and you can't get to, you just can't.
Or if you're on crutches, you can have temporary disability.
Exactly. So there was a lawsuit with Uber around that as well. And then they had to actually change that, where they allow more time for people that have disabilities. So, these are some of the legal ramifications, and it doesn't bode well for the reputation of companies, if they don't follow them. I mean, yes, they're going to have to write the check, but there's often reputational damage too, because who wants to work in an organization that calls people dino babies that are, and they're executives themselves?
Wow.
I know we have to we have to shake our heads.
I mean, you're like, what are they thinking? They weren't thinking.
They're not. Right, I was saying, not thinking. Not thinking.
I mean, it's one thing to say. I mean, it should never be said, but it's one thing to say behind closed doors, and it's another thing to actually put things in writing.
Correct.
And it's like, wow, and
you would think
that's where those actions come into play.
Yes, and you would think that executive leadership knows better, but not necessarily.
Yeah, exactly, because it was never. And this is one of my pet peeves, is like, I wish people who get promoted to a management position are required to take management 101. That should be like a precursor, prerequisite. And because people there are many managers in leadership that do not know how to manage teams, that do not know how to manage diverse teams, that do not know, and there's some, unfortunately, that for lack of a better word, are pushovers. They don't like having those uncomfortable conversations, so they ignore it. And so, I mean, teams it's almost like as a child, they test you, to see how much they can get away with. And you have to have consistency. You have to have fairness. You have to have that, at least for me, that open door policy, and not micromanage. You have to trust your teams, and earn their trust, and keep their trust. Because once it's gone, it's just like any relationship, so hard to get back. So wow. Management 101, people.
Yes, everyone needs to have it.
Yep, Coursera. You can get it for free.
Probably on LinkedIn. It's probably there somewhere too.
Yeah, exactly. So speaking about those courageous conversations, last question. I know we're pretty much getting to time. How can leaders foster an environment where courageous conversations about DEI can take place?
So this doesn't happen automatically. People are on edge to speak about the subject matter, which is not good, because if there's a subject that you don't speak about, how are we ever going to get to a different place with it? We're not. So dialogue is so important. It comes back down to culture. Does your company have a culture where this can be the case? No. So for example, we have a company here, very proud to say, a company called Keeley Construction. And they have, ever so often, I don't know how often they do this, but they have these sessions, and it's not called Courageous Conversations, but that's what it is, where they allow their employees to have dialogue together. They bring a speaker in. Like I came in once to talk about Juneteenth, and I was just so impressed about how, and it's voluntary, right? So
Oh, yes.
you're not required to come. And it was great because there was a young man in the room that talked about he grew up in a very racist household. And he talked about how when he was like 15, he moved out of his house because he just thought that that was wrong. And I was like, how does someone 14, 15 who grows up with this know that that's not the right thing to do? He said, because I used to watch, I guess they had like a housekeeper that would come to their home.
That was a minority.
It was a minority. And, he said they just didn't treat her humanely. And I just thought that that was so wrong. And I was like, wow. So what was eye-opening? I mean, I didn't know him. So it was eye-opening. First of all, the fact that he would say that out loud was amazing. But the fact that the employees that work with him heard that story, wow, that gives you a whole different dimension about that employee, right? I mean, that's someone that you could probably go and talk to about any and everything. So I think one way to do it is to provide space for that. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to create an environment where people feel safe, that they can have the conversation, not with any and everybody. I always tell my class, find people who are from places that you don't know anybody, right? And they can be the people that you go to ask the difficult questions. So find a friend. And that's really just about networking. And it's all about getting to know your colleagues. But at the same time, it's all about relationships. So if I feel comfortable, then I can ask you a question or something, like even for me. So I always tell people here at this institution, and because I'm in the DEI space, but I always say, feel free to come talk to me about any topic. And then particularly if you have a question about African Americans, that's where I come from. I can speak to that all day long. And there's no dumb question.
The only dumb question to me is the unasked one.
Correct. Yeah. I said, and if you ask me something and, I'm offended by it, I'll tell you that I'm offended, but I'll also tell you why I'm offended. Because it doesn't help if I just get mad and walk away because you're like, well, shoot, what did I do? So it's also just about, does the workplace that you're in foster that? So here at Olin in the business school, we do have one of my, a gentleman that's on my team. He actually leads a session called Inclusive Conversations. And every other month or so, we have these sessions. And we had one where we did it for Hispanic Heritage Month. And he brought in some external people from outside of the business school, some from the community and some from other organizations within Washington University. And it was so enriching. And it was like a full house. Like there was like not one seat. So there's a good 40 people in there. And I was like, wow, that's awesome. Is actually pretty good. And then we did one recently about how there was a gentleman over at the law school that has a book out about how to deal with differences, right? How do you deal with different perspectives?
Okay.
That was another one. We had a full house. So by doing that, at least our employees know there are individuals, because anybody that's been in those, you can pretty much believe they're someone that is positive about these kinds of dialogues. So I often tell people, find your tribe, within your workplace, because sometimes there's things you do want to talk about and you don't, and the thing that's always challenging is no one wants to offend anyone. So sometimes that's also why people don't ask questions. They're like, oh, if I ask and I ask it wrong. And I tell my students, I said, we're going to make mistakes. One reason for sure is because the language evolves, the language changes. For my people, once, we were Black, and then we were Afro-Americans, then we're African-Americans, and then some people are offended by any of those.
Yeah, it's the same thing with the Latin culture. Like I call myself Hispanic or Latina, but some people like no Latinx or I forgot what the other ones terms are called. There's some terms I hadn't heard. I was like, oh, I'm like, okay.
And someone told me in my classroom that Latinx was inappropriate. They said because they were saying because in which I do know because I know a little bit of Spanish, in words and in the A as we speak to a person, an A or an O, so a male or a female. So X to me, they said says that you don't see me. And I said, interesting. I said, because the last
it's
2 years
gender
I've been
neutral.
teaching this, no one said that.
Oh, it just means it's gender neutral. Yeah.
But some people will be offended by it.
Yep, exactly.
So I say all that to say, be in for the ride. Even myself, as a professor of practice in this space, I'm learning every day. But what's most important, what's most important is if you do offend someone, apologize and do so in a humble spirit. Because people will forgive you if you're honest about it. And if you are coming from, coming from your heart. And if you're curious about the mistake that you made, genuinely curious.
Yeah. And it's also okay to start a question. I was like, I hope I don't, if I offend you, I apologize. I just don't know how to ask this question. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I was wondering about blah, 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 or something.
Right.
It's okay to start that way. Let people know, because the only way your people will learn is to ask questions, to read, to study, but also and listen to different outlets. But make sure they're diverse books, they're diverse outlets, not just one here and one there, because you need those different perspectives, and because you're just going to hear one interpretation, or read one interpretation. And it's sort of like I had a guest on a few weeks ago who was an editor, and she said, "Who's going to write your story?" It's like, so you gotta, who's gonna ask your question, or answer your question if it's not asked. So basically, So wow, this has been such a great conversation, Giselle.
It has.
I can go on forever.
It has. I want to add one thing that you can maybe edit in if you would so like. One of the questions, I want to make sure I addressed it. When you talked, earlier you had talked about cultural differences and how they impact DEI efforts and how do they do it positively or negatively. And what I wanted to speak to is one way that it can be negative that I saw was when I was working in South Africa post-apartheid, because how do you change the tide where you didn't have Blacks as well or coloreds in any senior leadership roles in the workplace or, in government? So how do you fix that? And there's different schools of thought, but there's no I don't know if there's a right answer, because each answer has a plus and a negative, and they chose to actually have a quota system. So they have to have a certain number of Blacks, a certain number of coloreds, which are mixed race, certain number of whites in all categories. So it's like executive management all the way down to frontline employees. And I'll never forget this. I was working with my HR leader, and because the work that we were doing was going to net, we needed like 1,200 employees to do this work. And we were actually doing we were utilizing their employees because in Africa, in South Africa anyway, when a company tries to, now I asked for all this and now I'm screwing it up. What do you call it when a company outsourcing?
Outsourcing. Okay.
Yes. Okay. So in an outsourcing arrangement in Johannesburg, you're required that if it's a company outside, like a US based company, you have to partner with a company in Johannesburg in South Africa, which I think is great because it gives them an opportunity to get a piece of the pie so that companies just don't come in from outside and then start extracting labor to save money. Because for the first year, you have to keep and for the outsourcing arrangement, you have to keep all the employees. You can supplement that, but you have to keep what you have. But you have to do that, keeping in mind all the different levels in the organization and keeping in quotas for whites, for coloreds, and for blacks. And I'll never forget this. My HR person said to me at the executive hiring, need someone at the executive level. And she said, oh, we can't hire any more whites in the executive level. So I think my head spun around like Carrie in the movie. I was like, what did you say? So she repeated it. She's like, what's wrong? I said, I've just never heard that before. I said, it's just in the United States, that would never be something that we would say. And she said, well, it's because we just have too many whites at the executive level right now. So we just can't hire anymore because we're on this quota system. So I understand why South Africa did that, because how do you right the wrongs where people have been behind for so long? So I get that part. But the problem that it created is you then had people in position there that weren't qualified for the roles.
They weren't disqualified,
So that created a problem. But it's all about, how do you fix that? It's a hard question to answer, but I would say that's an example of where DEI had somewhat of a negative impact. For an example.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is there is no right or wrong way, really, that I could see exactly what you were saying. And
because in the United States, we would say we tried to address that with affirmative action, right? And some of us would say, well, you had to be overqualified, right? If you were from not part of the majority group, you had to be overqualified to get it. And that didn't seem to work well either. So it's a difficult nut to crack, which is why I think when it comes down to the equality equation is where people start to have challenges with the wording and they begin to ask questions like, oh, is the person qualified? I'm like, well, you should never hire someone that's not qualified.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, we're not going to send you somebody, because as I source candidates for a university, and it's like, I'm not going to source somebody who doesn't meet the qualification.
Exactly.
And it's like, it's a
challenge. But I would say the issue of when people have been oppressed for a long time, a certain education, unable to secure working in the trades, and have been shut out. What do you do about that? So I think that's a question that needs to be answered, and it's not an easy one.
No, it isn't, and it's going to be a trial and error. And I mean, right now, this is the first full school year that we've seen the effects of losing affirmative action. And there is a big decline in minority students across the nation. And so it's like, how do you address it? And what can we do? And since affirmative action may never come back. So it's the same thing as you said in the workplace. How do we address that?
And
listeners, if you have ideas, put them in the comments below if you have ideas.
Absolutely. I mean, because in the end, what we're talking about is we just want people to have a fair opportunity to get a certain job. We'll say job because we're talking about the workplace, right? We want everyone to be able to have a fair shot at that. And if someone is disqualified because of their diversity dimension, that's not great. And I'm not saying that people should get the job just because they have a diversity dimension. Qualifications reign queen and king.
Like I'm a diversity sourcer, and there's some positions that it's almost impossible for me to find a diverse candidate that meets all the requirements that they're looking for. So either the hiring manager needs to lower the standards to where more people, including more diverse people, can apply, and there's some maybe some kind of training component, or it's going to be the diversity is not going to look very good in
Right.
the applicant pool, but everybody, for the most part, will be qualified. So, yes, that is a question that needs to be addressed and thought about deeply. So, yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation, Giselle.
It's
I
been
just
a
love talking
delight.
about DEI. Likewise, yeah, I
Thank you
enjoy it.
so much. I look forward to who knows where this may go. Hopefully,
Exactly.
you and I can do something together because it seems like you and I are very much on the same page on a number of things. So we could be a pretty dynamite team.
I think so. I think so. We need to keep in contact because I would love to do something with you.
Same.
Awesome. So let's go into some key takeaways very quickly. Listeners, Giselle and I talked about global perspectives on DEI, and we gained some insight into how diversity, equity, and inclusion are approached in different countries and the unique challenges and opportunities that arise from cultural differences. We talked about understanding and addressing privilege and learned a little bit about the power of privilege, how it impacts dynamics, and what leaders can do to recognize and leverage their privilege to promote inclusion. We talked about taking action, allyship, bystanding, and championing DEI. And we talked about some practical steps for a little bit about becoming an effective ally, bystander, and DEI champion, and gained an understanding of why it's essential to involve everyone, including the white man, the white cisgender man, in DEI conversations.
Absolutely important.
Mm-hmm. We talked about navigating workplace inequities and legal implications, and gained a little bit of an understanding of the workplace changes related to inequities, their impact on employees and leadership, and why discrimination can be legally costly for organizations. Remember Uber and Denny's. Oh, Denny's, why? We talked about fostering courageous conversations in DEI, and explore the importance of fostering courageous conversations in the workplace to drive meaningful DEI change and align actions with DEI strategy. Any other key takeaways from our conversation that I may have missed, Giselle?
I think you got them all.
Oh, awesome.
Well done.
Thank you. Planning at its best. So let's go into some next steps for our listeners. So listeners, as you know, I always like to leave with a call to action, what you can do to continue learning and improve your understanding of DEI. So assess your understanding of privilege. Reflect on the concept of privilege and how it plays out in your workplace or classroom if you're a student. Identify ways you can use your privilege to support others. Take action as an ally or champion. Determine one actionable step you can take today to be an ally or champion for DEI in your workplace or classroom, such as speaking up against microaggressions or supporting a diverse colleagues or classmates initiative. Engage in courageous conversations. They can be scary, and make sure you're in a safe place first to engage in these courageous conversations. So foster courageous conversations within your team about DEI. Schedule a meeting or initiate discussions on the challenges your organization faces and how to address them. And follow Gisele Marcus for more insights. Connect with her on LinkedIn or visit her website at giselemarcus.com to learn more about DEI strategies, networking, and leadership. And subscribe to Get Diversifused. Subscribe. We love our subscribers. Stay informed about best practices and inspiring DEI conversations by subscribing to our podcast on YouTube or Spotify, and share this episode with your network to foster wider awareness. Remember, this is our last episode of the season. Our season 2 will come out, will start up again in February of 2025, people. Oh my gosh, 2025. February 2025. That seems like a long way away, listeners, but it'll be here before you know it. So, Giselle, how can our listeners get hold of you if they want to connect with you for any of your services, or if they want you to be a speaker, or if they want to write something with you, or just get connected with you as a professional in their network?
Sure. So I can be reached on LinkedIn at Gisele Marcus. Pretty unique name. You can find me there, Gisele, last name Marcus, Marcus, or you can find me on my own website at www.giselemarcus.com.
Cool. So listeners, I will have Giselle's contact information on one of the last slides of our podcast today, as well as in our summary of our podcast episode on YouTube and Spotify. So you don't have to scroll through the entire video if you can't listen to it all in one sitting. You can find her contact information there. So Giselle, it's been wonderful having you. And I look forward to staying connected with you. And anytime you want to come back, feel free. We have lots to talk about. DEI is not dead, as that one article was about. So yeah, we're going to keep it alive, and we're going to keep it thriving, and through our conversations and our actions. So you're welcome back anytime. Just ping me.
Thank you so much. Look forward to coming back. It's been a delight.
Awesome. Likewise. Okay, listeners, I will let you go. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and remember, stay diversifused. I'll talk to you later. Bye. Want to be a guest speaker on the Get Diversifused podcast? I'm on the lookout for guests, so if you're passionate about DEI and would like to share your unique insights, experiences, or success stories, I want to hear from you. If you're a fellow podcaster who's passionate about DEI, let's swap the mic and amplify each other's voices. If you're interested in being a guest, reach out to me at Andrea@diversifuse.com, and I'll send you the link to our guest interest form. Hope to hear from you soon. Remember, stay diversifused. Now go out there and make a difference. And as always, for more strategies on building inclusive workplaces and communities, check out Diversifuse. We're here to guide you on your DEI journey. Make sure to visit our website at diversifuse.com and follow us on social media for the latest happenings, blog posts, tips, and events.